tweet at BBC Talkback, text 81771 or email the programme talk.back@bbc.co.uk.
Well, if the Daily Telegraph is to be believed, Tim Davie, the BBC's new Director General, plans to overhaul the BBC's comedy output as part of a wider effort to rebalance the corporation in terms of impartiality and fairness. Tim Davie's making a big speech on Thursday, so we might find out if that report's accurate. In any case, it has triggered an avalanche of commentary. Is the BBC's comedy output too lefty? What exactly does right-wing comedy sound like? Does it even make sense to talk about comedy in those terms? 03030 80 55 55 if you want to get involved in this conversation with us. Andrew Doyle is with us, comedian and writer, author of Woke, a guide to social justice, and of course creator of Titania. Is it Titania or Titania? It's Titania, isn't it, Andrew?
Titania, yeah.
Titania McGrath, radical intersectionalist poet committed to feminism, social justice and armed peaceful protest. And the stand-up comedian and writer Tom Mayhew, easy to pronounce that one. Tom, how are you doing? Good afternoon to you.
Yeah, I'm all right, thanks, man. Yeah, how are you?
I'm doing great, but the weather's not great, I have to tell you. It's clearing up a little bit, working from home. What do you make of this debate now about left-wing and right-wing comedy?
Me, I think it's kind of been a bit... I don't know, I think maybe slightly out of proportion. I think a lot of people seem to believe shows like Mock the Week or the News Quiz are kind of less leading, whereas I don't think they are. I just think they're anti-government. I think whoever's in charge, they'll take the mickey out of, whoever is in office. Like, I think 10 years ago, things like Mock the Week, there'd be awful jokes about Gordon Brown. There'd be all sorts of nasty things about him. So I think generally you talk about the big stories on these shows, and often they involve whoever the Prime Minister is, so it comes across as being anti-Tory, but it's just, it's just anti-people in charge, really, anti-power.
It's a poke in the eye to the establishment.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Is that what's going on, Andrew, or do you see something deeper and more prejudicial?
No, I think Tom's right. That most comedians aren't political anyway, so it's a bit of a misnomer to think in terms of left and right. And of course, inevitably, comedians and satirists are going to have a go at whoever's in power. But it's not just about political power in the sense of left and right. It's also about cultural clout. And of course, in terms of the arts and politics and journalism, what's most in power is the social justice ideology, is what we might call wokeness. And this is the thing that the BBC are failing to show some kind of impartiality when it comes to. And the reason for that is the BBC is systemically woke. So there is a problem there. It isn't really about left and right. And so therefore, I think the incoming Director General is right to point out that it would be better if the BBC was sort of spread across the regions, because, of course, the employees at the BBC are twice as likely to be privately educated as anyone else in the country, are far more from that sort of upper middle class bourgeois background, and they tend to be the supporters of the social justice ideology. It isn't something that generally happens in working class communities, for instance. So
do you think that's more of a criticism of London BBC?
Yeah, well, it certainly applies there, and of course, so much of it is centred within London. But it's not just actually about London; it's also about the types of people who go into the media. I mean, you're much more likely to forge a successful career in the media if you have contacts, if through nepotism, if you are privately educated. These things are, this is sort of beyond dispute. So, I think that's the issue is more to do with an ideological impartiality that the BBC has rather than a political one.
Tom Mayhew, is the BBC the home of wokeness these days?
I don't know if it necessarily is. I think not just the BBC. I think a lot of TV channels definitely do play it safer than they might have done 10 years ago. Like, once again, just to use the example of Mock the Week, something that Frankie Boyle said 10 years ago, he now would not be able to get away with probably on Mock the Week. But I think that's not just the BBC. I think that's also ITV. I think that's also Channel 4 generally. They have to play a lot safer, whether that's because they have less money to work with or a smaller current audience, I don't know. But I don't think there's a big kind of drive to be woke. I think they just have to, for whatever reason, feel like they have to play it safer. That's why I think it is.
A couple of texts, Andrew, just wondering what you mean by woke, because lots of different people mean different things by it, don't they?
Yeah, I suppose the best way to look at it is because I mean, woke used to, back in the various, it originates from the various black civil rights movements of the 20th century, where all it meant was to be alert to social injustice, particularly racism, which of course is a good thing. And if that were the way the word was used now, we'd all be woke, myself included. But then it became sort of hijacked by a very kind of intolerant, illiberal social justice movement in sort of 2012, 2013, and it became more about narrowing the parameters of acceptable thought and opinion, insisting on what they used to call political correctness, but actually what it is now is a kind of perversion of that. And the best way to think of it is when the head of the Comedy Awards at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival 2 years ago, Nika Burns, she said that she was looking forward to comedy moving into the new woke world. That was the way she described it, where she said, younger comics would set the parameters of what was acceptable for comedians to say. Now, of course, comedians don't generally work well once they're told what they can and cannot say, because they are by nature subversive. So you're having this real problem. I mean, I part company with Tom a little bit in terms of the media. I think the media is overwhelmingly woke, irrespective of which channel you go to, and that's just the nature of the industry. And that's what's got to change, because actually comedy can't thrive when comedians are told that certain things are off limits.
And Tom, every social movement has its excesses, of course, so we wouldn't be surprised with the movement of wokeness, if I can call it that. Maybe the appropriate comedic response is simply to satirise the excesses of wokeness, Tom.
Yeah, I guess that is definitely what one thing you could say that people should do. But like, I don't know. Generally, I feel like if you're going to say that comedians should be able to say whatever they want to say, then surely if a comedian wants to be what you would define woke, then it's okay for a comedian to be that way.
Though Andrew did put some limits in there, didn't you, Andrew? We're not saying you put Roy Chubby Brown material on the TV. Yeah,
it's very interesting that a lot of the people who are objecting to what the incoming Director General has said are invoking people like Bernard Manning or Roy Chubby Brown, kind of comics that just haven't been around for decades. It's
That's
very
right,
weird.
and everybody's agreed that really doesn't have a place now. The world has moved on.
Well, I mean, I know Roy Chubby Brown still tours, doesn't he? I think, and I think you're well within your rights to go and see that. The solution, if you don't like, if you find comedy,
but would you commission him for a television series?
Well, that's the difference, isn't it? He wouldn't get commissioned now because our social mores have changed to such a degree that it wouldn't be viable to do so. So,
yeah, you don't want to give a platform to the kind of stuff he does.
Well, I'm not in a position to make that choice, but I think that the point that Tom was saying about, people should be allowed to be woke and comics as well, I totally agree. I think you should. The point is about diversity of opinion. We should hear. The problem is that if you want to get on the BBC as a comic and you want to satirise woke culture, you just won't get a foot in the door on the whole. So that's the problem, is that it's perfectly fine to take a political or ideological stance as a comic, so long as the gatekeepers of the industry aren't saying which ideological or political things can be satirised and which can't. In other words, it's just about having a breadth.
On the phone lines, here's Charlie. Hi, Charlie.
Hi, William. I used to love watching my comedy shows, especially on the weekend. You need a bit of a wine boom, Mark the Week and stuff live at the Apollo, but I just all swung left, and I just realised one night there that there were nothing more than just a bunch of angry, smart aleck socialists just spouting off at different social issues, and if you didn't agree with them, you were the worst in the world. So I unfortunately I've switched off, but I would love to switch back on again, and definitely I would appreciate and welcome a change in that regard if the BBC is going to do that.
Charlie, thank you very much. Andrew, I mean, I'm old enough to remember back in the 80s, Ben Elton doing that sort of political ranting kind of comedy. Nothing new under the sun here, is there?
No, and there's nothing wrong with it. Like I say, I'm all for complete artistic freedom, and people should be able to do whatever they want. And if comedians want to go on stage and just sort of repeat Guardian talking points for the occasional punchline and get laughs from the audience because they endorse their views rather than they find the jokes funny, then that's absolutely fine, and I don't have a problem with it at all. But I'd like to see comedians who don't want to do that do well as well. I mean, it's just there should be more room for everyone.
Tom, what about audiences when it comes to stand-up? Do you think audiences tend to expect comedians to be left of centre in their perspective and in the targets of their comedy, or would audiences be open to a right of centre targeted comedy?
I would say that would entirely depend on where in the country you're playing and what comedy club you're playing. You know, most comedians know that every gig you do have to kind of change your material, and I think most comedians would. I mean, especially before the election last year, when I did a gig, I would be looking at where you know, whether the place was right or left, and I'd probably try and maybe change a bit of material accordingly, because you don't want them to hate you, basically. So most comedians, you know, you do have to vary generally depending on where you are in the country, because what people like in Glasgow is very different to what people like in Sussex, you know. Ultimately,
you just want to be loved, Tom, don't you?
yeah, and I'm glad you said that. That's really made me, yeah. Oh, thank you, Seth.
Well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? Yeah. We all need a bit of love in our lives, but it's part of the attention role of comedy. But there's always been this kind of comedian as commentator role as well, Andrew. It goes back a long way in literature, as you know. When it comes to commentary, when it moves away from simply old style jokes into observational comedy, which is where we are these days, the perspective of the comedian involves the political perspective of the comedian.
It does, definitely. I think Tom makes a really good point there, is that, of course, like if you go out to an audience and express a view that everyone hates, it's really, really hard. And actually, I quite enjoy that challenge, though. And I also enjoy the theatricality of stand-up, which means that actually you can support a view you just don't hold, and experiment with that idea as a stand-up, because you're not really yourself on stage. You're a kind of persona, and that's really interesting. I mean, I did a tour with I was supporting the Jonathan Pye tour a couple of times, and which is a shows that I co-wrote, and I would be doing a pro-Brexit set at the start of this show to about 3,000 people who were all predominantly largely against Brexit, and that was a really interesting challenge, because it meant that I had to make sure the material was strong enough not to just annoy everyone. You know, I had to find a way to make people who fundamentally hated what I was saying laugh at what I was saying. So that to me was really interesting, and I like that challenge. I think a lot of comedians like that challenge. I think comedians sometimes do embrace ideas that they don't necessarily believe, and so it's not just about commentary. I think it's also about theatricality, you know.
And as part of that, were you kind of like having a conversation with the audience and assuming that they're going to be irritated by what you just said, to almost mock them for it?
Well, I'd always ask. I'd always take a kind of straw poll, like you know, give us a, you know, if it's simple as saying, give us a cheer if you voted Leave, and in a room of 3,000 people, 2 people cheer, and you think, okay, well, even if there are more, clearly that's not the popular view here. So, you know, that to me is quite interesting, because of course we know that it would have probably been more like 50-50, but the consensus is such that one view is so unfashionable that it cannot be expressed. And that's an area, for instance, that the BBC could do much better on, because the people at the BBC, the executives, I mean, everyone knows this, they didn't understand the Brexit result, and therefore they just couldn't comprehend it. And that's why you didn't have people mocking. You see, I thought both sides should be mocked. I thought Remain and Leave could be mocked, but we just didn't get that. And that's part of the problem.
Tom, how did you handle the Brexit stuff in stand-ups when you were allowed to do it before all of this nuttiness around the pandemic?
I mean, I'm probably literally one of about 3 comedians who I don't mention it. I'm not interested. I was so bored of it being on the news. I don't talk about it. I think there's bigger issues, you know, in my life personally. There's bigger issues in the world. I'd rather talk about, you know, I talk about a lot of things about, you know, class on stage, about things like, you know, my last year was about the benefit system. I'd rather talk about that and try and change that than worry about a result that now was 4 years ago. And I think people should just get over it, you know.
Well, that's a perfect segue to us, because we'll be talking about universal basic income and the benefit system when we come back after the news. For now, Tom Mayhew, Andrew Doyle, thank you both very much. It's 1 o'clock.